As Sagar mentioned, I met Swami Kriyananda many years ago in 1968. It was at that time that he was beginning this work of Ananda Sangha, and I was a young man, graduated recently from college, at that time of life, not really knowing what to do. I suspect many of you have been in that position. And my life took a radical change after meeting Swamiji. And I, for many years, served in the Ananda ashrams in America. And I was very happily serving until Swamiji some years ago, not too many years ago, in the early part of this century, he had shifted to India in 2003. And he called me, well, actually, I went to India because I had not seen him for a little while, and I was missing him, and I went to India, and the first thing he said to me when I saw him is, he said, I want you to shift to India. Now, I was very happy serving in the United States, but Swami asked, and I asked him, I said, well, sir, I'm serving in the United States. What would you like me to do here? And he said, I want you to serve. And what we need to do is we need to share these teachings of our Guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, and make his name more well known in this country of his birth. Now, of course, many people know of his teachings already, but yet this is a big country. Time has passed. Yogananda took Mahasamadhi 60, 70 years ago. It's been a long time. And we need to continue to revive that teaching. And there was that knowledge of him and the great work that he did, not just here in India, not just here in America, but he went to the West to share these teachings with the world. It was a world mission that he undertook, that his life had been predicted as such by his guru's guru, the great Babaji himself had chosen him to undertake this, to make his teachings well known, better known, these principles that are ancient, and to share these techniques to help people have a direct perception of what has been said, what has been told, what has been proclaimed since time immemorial, that we are children of the divine, and that God is our Heavenly Father, and that we can have in our own life a personal experience of that connection that we have. And it's not just that it would be a nice thing for us to do, but it would satisfy the deepest cravings that all of us have underneath, deep down within our heart. This is what we really want. Now, we don't always know that. That often needs to be revealed to us. But we want to commune. And we want to, as we titled this lecture today, Sagar suggested it. He said, what would be a good topic? And I asked him, I says, well, you think of something. And he says, how we can talk with God. Now, I emphasize one word in that title. It's not how you can talk to God. We often do that. How we can talk with God. Isn't that word with means communication, a two-way communication. But we have to ask the question, well, is such a thing possible? And does God want to talk to us? And maybe even more importantly, do we want to talk with God? I share these teachings in many places, and it was only last week I was in another city, and I was staying in a hotel, and I went to the lobby, and I was waiting for my ride to come to take me to the venue where we were doing a program. So I was sitting there, and in the lobby there was a group of young men, and boys really, but on that point in their life when they were changing from one to the next. And there were 12 of them. And I found it very interesting. It was so interesting to me to watch them that I surreptitiously took my mobile with its camera and I took a picture of them. And what made them so interesting to me, these group of young men, boys, was that there were 12 of them, and they were all sitting in the lobby close together in a group, but they were not talking to each other at all. Maybe you can guess what they were doing. There were 12 mobile phones, like this. 12 of them. Not one of them was looking at the other. Not one of them was talking to the other. They were all communicating with that mobile phone, playing games, of course, what they were doing, playing games on that. And I thought, this is an expression of what Swami Shankara, 1,000+ years ago, 1,500 years ago, he said, nobody has time for God. Children are busy with toys. Youth is busy with romance. Adults are busy with career and job and making money, family. Old people are busy with sickness and health. Who has time for God? Nobody has time for God. Now that was in the time of Swami Shankara. Has anything changed? No, it hasn't changed. It's the same. Who has time to commune with God? Who has time to talk with God? But some do. I see lots of people here today, and I suspect you're interested. But that's where we must begin. We must begin with the question, is anybody interested? Because if we're not interested, how can we expect God to be interested in having a conversation with us? After all, what is it that we ask anyway? Now those boys, they were very busy with their mobiles and playing their games. But I suspect if they were hungry, they'd want something to eat. You know, perhaps they'd need somebody to go get their luggage. They perhaps would like this or that. Or they have some desire, and then they'll communicate. I want something. Or I'll complain. And oftentimes why should God be wanting to communicate with us when all we do is complain and ask for things? And in a sense, so consequently, if we say, how do we have a communication with God, the first thing we have to ask is why should God even want to communicate with us if we pay absolutely no attention to him or her? I like to think of actually God in the female side, because that was Paramahansa Yogananda's way of communing. But why should there be any communication happening? We have to coax the divine into a conversation that we want to actually communicate with the divine. And when we can begin to attract that communication, then it begins to come. And it's not so different. Talking with God, communicating with God is not so different from the very rules that apply amongst ourselves when we have a conversation. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody? It's very important to you. You're important, and you ask somebody, I need to speak with you about this. And the person says, yes, okay, tell me. Well, you see, it's like this. Oh, wait a minute, my mobile's ringing. And they put it to their ear. Oh, okay, now what were you saying? Well, you see, it's like this. I've been having these troubles. Oh, wait a second. And again, something interrupts. And if that person you're speaking with can't pay attention to you, to give you any focus, are you going to have a conversation with that person? Do you even want to talk to that person? They're not listening to what you're having to say. They're not showing any interest. They're not present for you to be able to share. So in the same way, we're like that person, that salesman that won't give us the time of day, the person that won't listen to our things of in our heart. We have to win the attention by paying attention, by following the same rules that we do in conversation. We have to speak honestly with one another. We have to share with one another. We have to, if we want to have a real conversation, we have to show that basic interest. And it's the same way with attracting that conversation with God. It begins with us first. We have to win the attention of the divine. And how many of us, when we do win that attention, the first thing we do is begin to ask for something? Now, You know, just think if somebody comes to you, wants to have a real good conversation. I know people come to me and say, Jaya, can I have 5 minutes of your time? I know what's coming. They're going to ask for something. They want, well, it's okay, that's what I do. They want some advice. That's often the most. Or they complain. I had a fellow come up to me the other day, and he says, I want to talk about spiritual guidance. And I says, okay, I'd be happy. And he began to then give me a litany of complaints he had about another member of our Sangha. You need to give that fellow some spiritual guidance. In other words, is what he was saying. And if we approach a conversation like that, well, it's not going to happen. So this is the same way. We must approach this topic of how do we have a conversation with God? How do we talk with God? How do we entice God to come out of the darkness, to come out of the silence, and actually to commune with us, to speak with us? Well, I'd like to back up a little bit before I go into that. Because first we have to ask the question, is there really anything out there that's going to talk to us? It's a basic thing. It's a basic thing. Now, fortunately, this is one of the blessed things I have to say about living in India, is that people do have that belief. I don't have to convince people. Swamiji used to say, he said, it's difficult speaking in America. I was in Shanghai, not Shanghai, I was in Singapore last week also. And it's much like America in that way. He says, the problem with speaking in the West is that you must spend the first half of your discourse convincing the audience that you're not a fraud or that you have something to say, because they don't necessarily have that faith. But in India, people tend to have that openness of heart. But not everybody. Not everybody. Because we find this, you might say, this religion of spiritual materialism. This is only matter. This world there's nothing beyond this physical universe that we have. And these people that talk about spiritual things, it's not really true. You've heard it. You know that argument. But I think it's worth, at this amount at least, I do think it's worth addressing, because we don't want to simply be superstitious. And there's something, I think, in all of our hearts that, yes, we've been brought up in a spiritual tradition, but is it really there? Is God really there? God, are you really behind the darkness? Is there something is going to respond to me? And perhaps that's one reason we don't talk to God. We don't have that conversation, because we're not convinced through our own personal experience that there's going to be something there to talk back to us, or to talk with us, that with which we can commune. Now, we can read the books and the scriptures, and they tell us that that is so, that there is something there. But yet, that's not enough. That's not enough. The next thing is that we listen to the stories of the great ones, the great saints. Now that is, if you have a friend who comes and tells you they saw a wonderful movie, it was really great, you're going to have some faith, perhaps, that you might like it. You might like it. And you know that the movie is there, so okay, I'll go. So when we have the great ones, they come and they share that, yes, this is real. We have some faith in that. There was a great story from the life of a Western saint from in the time 300, 400 years after Christ's time. He lived in the desert for 80 years. He lived to be over 100 years old. Over 80 years in caves in the desert. And at that time, his name was Anthony, Saint Anthony. He was a saint, recognized as that, as a hermit. And he was a wealthy young man, and he gave all of his money away. And he went off into the desert as a hermit. At that time, there was a great heresy, schism in the spiritual church there in Egypt, where he lived, North Africa. And the bishop, who knew Antony, went out into the desert, far out, found him, brought him back to settle the dispute. And the dispute was Jesus Christ merely a common man who had some nice philosophy, or was there something greater about him? And so the bishop went, got Antony, brought Antony back, and a big crowd in a cathedral that they had there had been gathered and were arguing. And Antony walked in, this desert hermit. You can imagine what he probably looked like. He probably had some sort of a robe, probably had long uncut hair, maybe matted even, who knows, and probably a long beard. And he was elderly by this time. He was 80, 90 years old by that time. But he walked within, very upright. Walked in, went up to the front in a very loud voice. He said only 3 words, and he left. 4 words. He said 4 words. I have seen him. And he had such power. You see, now 4 words spoken by you or me might not have that power. But he had power, and everybody stopped, and the argument ended, and he went back out to the desert. And you could see the testimony of the great ones. We can accept that, and you say, yes, I will try that. But even that is not enough, because still, they have seen God, they've communed with God, but it's still, I haven't seen. I've heard about oranges, I've heard about pears and apples, but I haven't tasted it. I want to taste it for myself. And that is what the position that we are in. We want to commune for ourselves. And until we know that, we're not going to be able to truly know, is there something there? We have to experiment for ourselves to be able to draw that and see, does it work or does it not work? This was my teacher's, one of his mottos. He said, does it work? You can do all of these things, and you can argue whether it's good, bad, but the answer has to be determined by, does it work? And if it doesn't work, put it aside. Find something that does work. That's, of course, what led me here to this. Now, I think one of the problems that people have with answering this question, is there something out there, is they are either going by belief, but some of us in this modern age cannot just simply go by belief. And I would advise you this, if you do not believe, that's perfectly fine. I recommend, though, that you not disbelieve. Leave the door open and be fair. Say, I do not know if there's anything there. How can you know? How can we know until we experience for ourselves? We just can't take testimony alone. Until that time, leave the door open to the possibility that something is there. And if you put that aside and you say, oh, I don't know, Lord, I don't know, God, Divine Mother, if you're there or not, but I'm going to give it a chance. There's a wonderful story I remember of the great Saint Ramprasad. And Ramprasad would talk to Divine Mother. He'd say, Divine Mother, and all day long he would talk. And one day his daughter comes up to him and says, Daddy, Papa, why do you keep talking to Divine Mother all the time? She never, why are you always talking to her? And his father, Ramprasad, says, child, she's very dear to me, and I talk to her she's in my heart all the time, but she's a very naughty mother. She never talks back to me. And so then the little girl says, well, Daddy, if she never talks to you, why do you keep on talking to her? And she runs off. Well, that night he goes home and he sees his wife and he says, our daughter today, this is what she asked me, this really strange question. And he relates that story to his wife. And the wife says to him, that's not possible. Why? Because our daughter is not here. I sent her to our relatives in the village far away only yesterday, and she's not here. And so Ram Prasad in that say, he felt great blessing because it was the Divine Mother he felt playing a trick on him, that responding to him. But see, although she didn't respond to him, he kept open that possibility. And I think this is for us to do. There's one of the stanzas at the beginning of one of the chapters of the Bhagavad Gita in the middle. It says, "To you, Arjuna, I reveal these teachings to you who have overcome the carping spirit. I reveal these truths." You see, to you who have put aside that tendency to always reject, no, it's not possible. Yes, he's a wonderful man, but wait till I tell you the other side. Or that was a great movie I saw the last week, but then you do the negative side. This was wonderful, but. Always that tendency to fault find the carping spirit. God cannot penetrate the carping spirit. There's always that side that's putting out the rejection of why things are negative. You have to have the openness of heart. And when you have an openness of heart, then the heart is properly, you might say, prepared to be able to receive this message. You're able to receive something from the Divine Mother. Then you have the possibility. Now, I began these teachings, as I mentioned, in 1968. I met Swami Kriyananda, and I have to admit, as a young graduate from college, my mind was scientifically, materially inclined. I was not devotionally inclined. Most graduates perhaps are not at that point. I was in the world. But yet, I read the autobiography of a yogi, and I was stunned. I was vibrationally in tune with it enough to be able to be moved by it on a very deep level. But I didn't believe it, you see. Now, I don't know how anybody could believe it, coming from a background such as mine, which is material, scientific. But I sensed something in that book that was sweet, that was sincere, that was, if I could use the word, I wouldn't have used it then, but it was holy. There was something beautiful about it, beautiful about the possibility. What if it is true? If it was true what he's saying in this book, my whole mental framework must change. The way I'm looking at the world is not right. There's something different. There's something larger that encompasses my little view of this life. Not that that was wrong, but it was too small. There was something more. But I was afraid to believe it, really. But I didn't believe it. But what saved me, and which is why I come back to this point a second time, which I just remembered, I didn't say no. I didn't say it's not possible. I didn't say this is rubbish and put the book aside, as sometimes people do, because their mind is closed to the possibility of something. And if it's not possible for that beauty to exist, you're not going to see it. So you open the mind to something larger than what you are accustomed to. You don't maintain a framework that limits you. And if you can be open, not that you should believe something, I'm not saying that, but if you can be open to the possibility of something larger, you have created a fertile ground by which you can begin to receive something. And as it was, I said, I don't know if this is true, but I'm going to experiment. I'm going to find out for myself, because this is too important. Either this exists, this possibility, or it doesn't. Now, I came to something that Paramahansa Yogananda said we should do. I came to this on my own, but I later confirmed it by something he wrote. He said, to ask the question, what is God, which naturally we want to ask, all of us. I think most of us at some point must ask that. Arjuna asked it in the Gita, and Krishna tries his best from many different directions to answer that question for him. And all of us, we hear about it. What is it? Yogananda says, he said, if you're asking the question, what is God? Probably you're asking the wrong question, because the mind is never going to be satisfied. And actually, the mind cannot be satisfied by a rational explanation, because God cannot be proved rationally, nor can it be disproved. You have to go beyond the rational mind to something else. Now, what Yogananda said, he says, God, don't ask what is God, but ask the question, how do I know God? And again, what works? How do I know the answer? Or how can I find out that answer? And so, of course, Yogananda, as I was reading those teachings, he provided many different things that one could do. And I began to practice these things. One of the things I began to do was, Swami Kriyananda recommended that I begin to meditate, which I did. I started to meditate, but I was not very good at it. I have to admit, I was not very good at it. I could not keep my mind still for more than 5-10 minutes, if that. And I'm being very generous when I say still. I was not all that still, because when you're young, it's difficult. But I tried. I kept trying, and he said, don't worry, do what you can. And I began to notice something as I tried to meditate. I began to notice that there was restlessness in my mind, restlessness in my heart, restlessness in my body. And that restlessness expressed itself with a constant conversation going on in my mind. And I ask you, if you sit for a little while, you can keep the mind quiet, but pretty soon you're going to start having a conversation. You're going to start talking in your mind, objectifying life, talking to life. Even in your thinking, you're going to have a conversation about it. And I asked myself the question that I ask you, who are you talking to? Who are you talking to? Now, what I said, and answer comes to mind, I'm talking to myself. Isn't that, what would we think? I'm talking to myself. But where does that other self, I'm here, myself, where is that other self residing? And I began to experiment with something. I said, if I'm talking to myself, why don't I think of it perhaps as my higher self, my conscience, you might say, or why not even take the direction that Ram Prasad said? Why not talk to the Divine Mother? Maybe I'm talking to the Divine Mother. Divine Mother, this is really hot out here today, and I wish I could find some shade, and I'm really thirsty, and all of the things that go through your mind when you're restless, when you're working, everything. Why not talk to God? Just make that conversation and transform it to something divine. And I said, I'm going to try that. And so what I did is I began to talk to Divine Mother, and I think of the Guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, as the Divine Mother in a way. So I began to talk to Guru, Divine Mother. And that was how I began to proceed. And it had a wonderful result for me, because during the day, I found myself talking to God. And I started to make it a conversation. And I began to make God my friend, my higher self, whatever it was, as if it was my friend, commenting on everything that's happening around me. As we do when we're speaking, we began to talk. And I said, I'm talking anyway, let's make it to God. And I began to talk to that and talk to that. And I discovered something as I began to study a little bit. This is a traditional practice. I didn't invent this, I just discovered it. This is a traditional spiritual technique and practice that goes back, way back. Now, it's in Christian tradition, there's it's called practicing the presence of God. In other words, practice as if talk to God. Practice that God's with you all the time. And direct your conversation from the mundane to the spiritual. Because that's what it becomes. The mundane becomes spiritualized if you're directing it, if you're dipping it in holy water. And so this is the first, I began to notice that. There was another famous Westerner, I don't know what country he was from, but he began to experiment with the technique of praying continuously. Always praying, 100%, all the time. Something similar. But then I read about Swami Ramdas. How Ramdas, every moment of his waking day, Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Shri Ram, Om Shri Ram, all the time. And it's a variation of that. And what happens is when you begin to put something spiritual into your life, you begin to drive out all of the other things. And it focuses the mind toward that. So I began to experiment with that. And I ask you too, just take your conversation and have a conversation with God, whatever you're doing. And you'll begin to make that relationship sweet. And little by little, that began to transform my own consciousness within myself. And then I ask you to do that and see what happens after time. Your devotion begins to grow. It begins to awaken. Now, some of the things that I learned as you begin to have a conversation with God is you have to be, and especially within yourself, you have to begin with complete honesty. Who are you fooling? If you're inside talking, and you're talking to God, or to whatever your conception is, who are you fooling? You're only fooling yourself. You have to be completely self-honesty. And though it's one of the abilities that will allow a person to stick with their spiritual life over the long haul. If you're not honest, you're closing yourself off. You're walling yourself in the ego. So share even the worst parts of yourself. Not with guilt, not with shame, not with regret. Just share. Here I am. You see me, Lord, as I am, and share that. Now, as you're sharing, it's helpful if you have some conception of what God is. The intellectual will think of some probably non-form, but if you feel form, it does not matter. You choose the form or the non-form of what appeals to you. But it's good to have some conception. But we have to remember always that God is beyond any conception, and God is all conceptions. So there's no competition, really. It's what God responds to us in our own unique way. And when we share with God, we share as if it's a trusted friend. Divine Mother, I am here before you, and I lay everything at your feet. Tell as you would a trusted friend speaking in a conversation. Just share that. And you'll find that as you begin to share very openly and honestly, your plans, your ambitions, your worries, your hopes, your fears, you find that you become freed of them. There's somebody listening to you, and you have shared them out, and they become clarified for you. And you'll find that in that act of doing that, in a subtle way, answers to many of your questions will begin to come to you. Just in the sharing of them in your heart, you begin to draw an answer. If you're honest and you're open, you begin to draw that. Now, the other part that comes to this, of course, is we want to share, we want to do it openly, we want to do it trustingly, we want to give love. But at the same time, one other thing also is in there, is we want to receive an answer. We don't want to just do the ones, that's not enough yet, because we're still doing the talking, you see. We also have to be able to receive. We want to receive, but there's many things that are blocking us from being able to receive. One, we don't maintain our interest. I had a story that was told to me by Swami Kriyananda. When he was a monk and Yogananda was still alive, he was sent to the hospital because one of the devotees was about to die. And so somebody needed to go and be with him at that moment. And so Swami was chosen to go. So he went to the hospital, and the man was literally on his way out within that hour. It was a young boy, actually. It was a young man. It was not a boy, but a young man. And the young man's mother was sitting by the bedside, and she was weeping. She was weeping. One, she was weeping for her son. But two, afterwards, after the young man passed, she came out. She was weeping not only for her son, she was weeping for herself, because she confessed to Swamiji, says, here he was, the last hour of his life. I was praying and praying and praying for him, and I couldn't help but my mind would wander and think about mundane things. The groceries. What am I cooking for my husband tonight? All these kept these thoughts. He says, at this critical hour, I could not keep my mind on my prayers. And she was weeping because of it. She saw that as a great failing. And of course, in some ways, it's instructive. And Swami, of course, comforted her in that. But isn't that how it is? If we can't keep our mind on that conversation, how are we going to be able to carry it on? We have to be able to focus it to that degree. And so in order to receive an answer, we have to pay attention. We have to be open to be able to receive. We have to remove those blockages that say, no, 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 I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear this, that, or another thing. Many people, it's something I repeat often, ask me for advice. People came to Swami Kriyananda also asking for advice. And I've learned that people really don't like advice too much. And you have to be very careful giving advice. What people want is they often are looking for confirmation of their existing opinions and directions. And until those are reduced and a person is truly open, wanting advice, I often will tell somebody when they say, you know, what do you think I should do? And I said, well, do you want my advice or do you want my support? And I said this to one fellow once, and he thought it over, and he says, well, honestly, I think I want your support. I says, you have it. I support you fully. What you're doing is great. Now, I wouldn't have said it if it really was harmful. It wasn't harmful. He wanted to know which one. And I could tell, he really wanted me to say A, not box B. And so I said, why don't you do A? And he said, thank you, that's what I want. And away he went. Because it wouldn't have done him any good. If he said the other, he would have done that anyway. But we have to, if we really want advice, we have to be we have to be open to whichever. And then to be able to accept that advice, maybe I wouldn't say joyfully, because sometimes we're not sure of that. But we have to, if the heart is open, we have to be able to be neutral at least. To be able to say, okay, that advice comes to me, I will follow that advice. I'll insert here a little joke. This, it's said that the Pope has a direct hotline telephone to God. When God needs to talk to him, he calls him up on the phone and calls the Pope. And so, this is an Italian joke, of course, but so the God calls, the phone rings, the hotline rings, and Pope picks it up, and it's God on the other side talking to him. It says, yes, what is it, God? He says, well, Pope, I want to tell you, I have some good news for you and some bad news. He says, oh, what is it? He says, well, the good news is I've decided what the world needs is one religion in which everybody believes and adheres their faith to. And the Pope thinks, that's great, God. I'm really glad. That's going to be very, very helpful, and I'm glad to hear it. And God says, well, the bad news is I'm making this call from Mecca. Maybe not a good joke. But the Pope, you have to be open to be able to, the idea here is you have to be open to receive whatever comes. Good news, bad news, whatever it might be, because there is no such thing really as bad news, good news. It's news. And so what our intuition, if we're praying, God, reveal to me. I want to understand. In the Bible, one of the famous kings in the Bible, the Old Testament, was Solomon. And Solomon was a holy king. He was a spiritual man. And Solomon prays to God, and God comes to him in vision. He says, Solomon, what is it? I will grant you whatever you wish. What would you have? And Solomon says, Lord, grant me an understanding heart. And God says, Solomon, because that is what you asked for, and you didn't ask for wealth and riches, that is what I will give you. But in addition, because your request was pure, I give you all the others as well, you see. And so we pray, and then we have to be receptive to what the answer comes. And oftentimes in our prayers, we have preconceived notions. We want support for our position rather than advice. And we have to be able to, we have that neutrality, that be able to be open to be able to receive. And so consequently, if you find that if you can learn to go beyond where my beginning point was, my mind was so restless I couldn't sit still, you have to get to the point where you can sit still. Be still and know that I am God. That's what the scripture says. Then you begin to feel those whispers coming to you. A great saint once said, I pray to God with all my heart, but I pray and pray, and I can pray no more with words. Only whispered yearnings come from my heart. And in that, we then go beyond the mind, and then we're able to receive. Now, I recommend, when I'm seeking advice, I don't know what to do, I pray and I have my conversations with God. And I then follow what Yogananda's advice that he gave. He said, pray with attention. Talk to God. Call to God. Divine Mother, come out of the darkness and looking here at the point between the eyebrows, at the spiritual eye. It says, call from that point. And then, with firm attention, all your heart, all your mind, all your body, all your soul, give it that. And then feel here in the heart what that answer might be, without prejudice. And try to feel, and hold up one possibility. One possible answer might be this. How does it feel in the heart? How does that feel in the heart? And little by little, in this way, you will begin to refine your intuition, because the response that you get in a conversation with the divine is intuitive. You begin to intuitively awaken and you begin to see in the answers that come to you through life's circumstances. Don't be superstitious. Oh, the parking space opened up. I guess it meant for me. Well, that's a little bit superstitious there. But look with an intuitive heart, and you'll begin to see that in little ways, life begins to respond to you. And as you have that guidance, it's important then to act on it. This is how we build the intuition. We have to try to increase it, but then we act on it in little ways first. And then we refine it in bigger ways and bigger ways, until finally that intuition starts to become clear. And we begin to actually draw answers through our intuitive faculty begin to come to us. And then we begin to feel in other ways. We begin to feel God's response to us. We begin to feel, and we can hear in, you might say, in the world around us, we begin to hear guidance coming to us. You could say, if we go this way, we could begin to feel, no, that doesn't feel right. We go this way, that feels right. And somehow the world itself begins to respond positively and negatively. We are not separate from the world around us. We are part and parcel of that world around us. And we begin to feel ourselves a part of this divine play, not as separate entities, alone by ourselves. And as we feel ourselves to be a part, we find that a sense of joy begins to come to us, because we're not alone in this world, and the life itself begins to have meaning for us. This is a very beautiful thing. But we have to prepare ourselves for that. Paramahansa Yogananda said one of the very best ways to do this is one, yes, we have to learn to call with divine devotion. We have to stimulate. We have to stimulate devotion. When Swami Kriyananda first, he was my teacher there, when he first met Paramahansa Yogananda, he was a very intellectual man. Swami Kriyananda was a genius, really. He was a genius on many levels, but yet he was dry because he was intellectual, rational. And when he met Yogananda, Yogananda would tell him again and again and again, get devotion, get devotion, get devotion. Do everything he could to get that devotion. And what is the basis of devotion is the sincere desire of the heart for God. A sincere desire for God to talk to us. A sincere desire for God to respond to us. And we have to have that as the foundation, because who has time for God? Nobody has time. And if you don't have time, if you're hungry, you'll want to eat. And if you don't have that hunger, you'll find that you're not going to get a response. And there's two ways you could say that hunger is developed in us. The first way is pain, suffering. Suffering comes in life and we say, why? And we want to get away from that suffering. Now, suffering comes to everybody. People think that some people don't suffer. Everybody suffers to some degree. But some perhaps suffer more. And that suffering drives them to seek answers. But there's another way also. And that way is to have a taste of something beautiful. And if you have that taste, you won't be able to stay away from it. And this is the way I recommend this rather than the suffering route, because we've suffered enough. Now let's have a taste for something beautiful. And if you have that taste, you're not going to be able to resist it. And you're going to, you might say it's a curse in that way, because you're going to put things down, and that's what you're going to seek in life, because that's what has meaning to you. But you have to have that, a sense that this is about life and death. The spiritual path is a life and death issue, a spiritual life and death issue. And when you have that fervor, you're honest, and you do the work that is necessary to be able to draw a response, God will respond in mysterious ways. In mysterious ways. And my life has been blessed in that way, and I wish but these things can't be expressed rationally through words. They're experiences that come that are beyond words. They begin to come to reassure us that yes, you're on the right path. There is something more than what we're led to believe, that this is a world of beauty, this is a world of mystery, this is a world of unknown possibilities. But who is willing to take up the work involved to make it happen for themselves? That's what the great ones come, age after age after age. This is Paramahansa Yogananda came with that mission to try to awaken souls. But if you look back through history, the great ones, the great saints, they all come with that same message to wake up. And until we wake up for a little while, this is what Yogananda said. He said, most devotees that come, they wake up and then they go back to sleep. Some wake up, stay awake a little longer, then they go back to sleep. But a few wake up and they get up and they start to run. And he says, those are the ones that I want. But yet, they're there, out there. And probably many of you are exactly that. To get up and start running and have that faith. And God will respond to us. God will speak to us. God is our very, very own. But we have to make space for that to happen. Paramahansa Yogananda came as a great messenger of the divine. He came with a mission. And that mission was to give people more than belief. We've had belief for centuries. People believe. But that's not enough. We now live in an age, it's a very unique age. It's Yogananda and his gurus, Swami Sri Yukteswar particularly, taught him that we've actually moved into an age that's much different than what went before. The ages before, for many thousands of years, were very much based upon material matter. But now we've come into an age of science. Of energy, of investigation. People are no longer satisfied with just, that's the way my ancestors did it, so that's how I'll do it. We now want to know. And in such an age, he said it's necessary to give people tools to be able to answer these questions for themselves. And this is what this line of gurus has done. They've come into the world with tools and say, try this. And for yourself, you will begin to understand and answer the questions that your heart has been answering. And so they've brought these tools. Now, primarily, they brought the tools of pranayama, the Kriya Yoga technique, the Kriya Yoga science. But they've also, for all of us, I recommend to you, learn to meditate. Learn to open two things. You might say, we need to learn to channel that devotion, stir up devotion, as Yogananda would say, in your heart. Have that devotion, talk to God, form a relationship with God. But then, remember, you cannot do all the talking. You have to give space to listen. So we have to, our devotional effort, you might say, is our side. We focus it, we form that relationship, we appeal, we talk. And then the meditation part is learning to sit, open up the intuition, and be able to receive the answer. And that comes when we can be silent, when we can turn off the radio of static that's going on in the mind. I mentioned when I started, I could not do that. It took me a long time. You begin then to calm it. But if I know, if I can do that, you can too. Because I was pretty restless, very restless. And if I can do it, I'm sure anybody can do it. And hundreds and thousands and millions of other people have done it as well. Learn to listen, and you begin to receive. And so we talk with God. Talking with God means a conversation. I do my part, I listen, God does His part, and then I respond to that. And when it becomes dynamic, it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. You begin, and there's really nothing you can say other than thank you, God. Thank you, God, because you feel you're a part of that. It's a dance, a duet. We're in this together. And when you have that response, you find that there's no fear anymore. You don't worry about anything because you know that God is with you. God is with you. Whatever comes, it's going to come. My karma, God's protection, whatever. And you can let it all go. And this is what I think all of us, on some very deep level, this is what we're looking to achieve in our life, is to be able to have that ongoing conversation with the divine. And so what we want to do today, in conclusion of our discourse, is we wanted to give you a little bit of a meditational exercise to get you started of listening to God. And I was supposed to, at this point, invite questions, but I'm going to hold the questions until later. And I'm going to invite Sagar back, and he's going to lead you in a little bit of an exercise. And let's do this first, Sagar, and then afterwards, then we'll come back with time for the questions and answers. Okay, so come. I would like to invite questions at this time. We have a little bit of time left. If there's anybody who would like to ask something particular, please do so. And I will do my best, or with Sagar's help, we will answer as best we can. Yes, sir.
Jaya, I recently read a book, Conversations with God, by Neil. So in that, Neil was asking direct questions to God, and he was getting direct answers. So can we have that similar kind of feeling, all of us?
The great masters, Paramahansa Yogananda, they would have direct conversations with God. In the sense, there was a wonderful example of that. He was referencing a book of Yogananda's Conversations with God. Beautiful example of that is Master Yogananda went into a state of samadhi. They would have at the ashram, once a year, they would have a public 8-hour meditation to which people were to be invited, devotees. And during one of those, he went into a deep state of samadhi in which he entered into a conversation with God in the form of Divine Mother. And so in that state, he would ask his question, and then Divine Mother God, in that sense, would use Yogananda's voice, change his voice a little bit, and answer his question. And he was having this conversation. And so this went on for a while, and everybody felt extremely blessed at that. But it was not an unusual thing. That just happened to be in public, which was unusual in that case. But Yoganandaji would have those sorts of conversations where the masters would appear to him. The great saints throughout time would appear to him and would talk to him in direct conversation. Now, that is possible. That's the testimony not just of Paramahansa Yogananda, that is the testimony of saints throughout time, history, that God will appear. We can draw them through the devotion of our heart. But now you must remember that we have to reach that point of elevation to be able to do that consciously. But there's also many accounts that also the divine takes form spontaneously, even to those of us who have not reached that state of the great masters. But that usually is not under our command, you see. But we're blessed because that's a special grace that comes. And that comes to those people, most usually, are people who have great devotion as well. But even sometimes, even to those who maybe wouldn't expect, because you cannot limit the divine. You can't say this and that and not that. It works under its own will. So yes, we have to have that faith, because it's not just a belief, it's been testified to by saints throughout time. And but yet we can encourage that, you see. The great ones like Master did that under his will, because he had formed that relationship. We have to get to know the divine. We have to cultivate that. And that's what we do every day in our relationships. Talk with God regularly. Make him your companion. Make him your best friend. Make him however you choose. This is where we have to define that. So yes, the answer is yes. Yes, sir.
I heard Paramahansa Yogananda met Babaji.
Yes, sir.
The second question is Babaji still around on this planet?
There again, he's, in case you did not hear that, he's asking that if you read the autobiography, you see reference to Babaji, the Mahavatar Babaji, who appeared to many of the saints referenced in that book. The question is Babaji still appearing to people? Is he still around, as you say? Because it's said in the autobiography that Babaji retains his body and appears, and that Babaji is charged with a spiritual mission to help guide the spiritual unfoldment of this planet, you might say. I have not had that blessing, but I have met people who I trust, who have. I think I have met at least 6 people in my life who have claimed to have met Babaji. Some of them I only met casually, so I can't say if that, to whether they were telling me truthfully or not. But a few of them, yes. Now, I'll tell you one story. There was one man that I know. I've met him many times. He's friends of the Ananda Sangha. He is a guide in the Himalayas, he's a mountain guide. And he says that Babaji has met Babaji a few times. And I trust this man because he's of high integrity. He's a villager. And he was a villager up by Rishikesh. He was, it's difficult to make money in the villages, and so he came here to Mumbai. That's what brought him to mind, because we're here. He came to Mumbai, this was many years ago, in the 1980s, I believe, to make money. He got a job in a hotel as a porter, a helper in the hotel. He was a poor man, but he was working there, and one day his boss came to him and told him that you must go outside. There are 2 men wanting to speak to you outside. So he did. He went out, and there were 2 men there that he didn't recognize. He didn't know who they were. But they told him, he says, the younger of the 2 men was rather tall, very, very well featured, and told him that he wanted him to go back to Rishikesh, settle himself there. He must go back. And he wanted him to be available to help, to show his devotees of him places that were sacred to him. So this porter did not know who this was, you see. And he said, but sir, I'm a poor man. I can't do any of those things. He says, don't worry about the money, it will come. This is what I want you to do. And so this man went back to Rishikesh, made his way back, and within a very short order, a man came to him asking to use him as a guide to show him around various places where he lived. And he did. He showed him around, and at the conclusion of that, gave him a very large check. in appreciation, because he was such a good guide and good man, gave a very large check to be able to, and from that he began to show others. Well, that very man, about that time, was beginning to show other people around, and members of Ananda Sangha in the 1980s contacted him because we had heard about him. He was a good man and he knew that area, and we wanted to use a guide. And so we contacted him, and he became the guide for Ananda Sangha people that we knew. We always referred people to him, and we helped him start his travel business. And as it turned out, he later learned that those two people that he had talked to in Mumbai were Babaji and Lahiri Mahashai. And he didn't recognize them, of course, but later he saw the book. He says, and Babaji promised to come back to him in the future, and did. Visited him later on up toward Badrinath, up in that area. So I trust his judgment. I've met another lady not too long ago, a year or two ago, who a very similar story happened, but different. Of course, circumstances for her were different. But again, Babaji and Lahiri Mahashai came to her as well. And I trust both of those. But, so that's and this story has been repeated many times by other people, that Babaji is not limited, of course. He's, when you're of that caliber, you can pretty much do as you will. Yes, sir.
I have a little confusion about the concept that you mentioned. Sometimes you say God and sometimes you say Divine Mother. According to yoga, there is only one God, Supreme Reality, that is called Purusha Vishesh, and it has got no genders. So therefore, I require to be advised about what concept I should have. It is divine power is one and can have many forms and many, avtaras and all those things. But just clarify to me that one concept where I can see God as one.
Well, you answered that question almost for yourself there, because God is one. God is beyond concept, but appears in many forms, because the human mind cannot conceive of Brahman. I mean, it's not conceivable by the human mind, but it's experiential. It's experientially possible to experience that. But for you to verbalize that into a concept, you can only use approximations and describe aspects, describe those things that are dear to you. So some people say one thing, some people say another thing. What was that famous song that Gandhi used to love to sing? A Ramdun, but you cannot describe it, encompass it. He's beyond whatever you describe. It's beyond that, because it's infinite. Infinity cannot be contained. Infinitely large, but also infinitely small. So you have to choose the concept that has relationship to your heart or mind, and you have to use that concept. I tend to just personally, because a true guru, God-realized guru, who has gone beyond any limitation, is one with the divine. You could say the guru's God too. And this is the scriptures say that. So I tend to, although I can keep the difference in my mind, but I tend to think of the guru as God as also. But I know that I don't want to confine it to a form. So I think of the mother, I think of the divine. I tend to be very impersonal. Shankara, Vedanta, right? We think of Shankara as supreme philosopher, non-dual, Advaita. But yet he also wrote scripture about the Divine Mother, and he poems and scriptures. So you have to see it's beyond. yet also contained, because the human mind and the heart wants to have something to relate to. You have to, and if you, the infinite void is very hard to hold in the heart. So you give it form, but the form, you cannot limit things. And this is where, of course, religions in the world, they go wrong, because they argue, this form, not that form. You see, but God comes into all, it's in all the forms. But it's like the 6 boys arguing about the elephant. You know that story, I'm sure. So it's like that. It's like that. It's beyond. And so you have to choose for yourself, how do you hold infinity? Each of us in our own way. Well, sir, I think our time is up. And I'll be here for after, if you want to come after, and we can chat here up in the front. I'm going to, because our time is at the end, I'm going to let people go who are being very polite, perhaps, and staying and listening here to our questions. But if you have others, please come afterwards and we can chat more. So.